Yeah, exactly.
Click. And we're live. It is Monday, July 26th, 2021, 5:01 p.m. And we have to start with a hearty welcome back to Christopher Argyris, who is in the audience today. We have tried to bring him on screen. We have failed. We are going to keep trying. He is wants you all to know, as he has said in the chat, that he is A, alive, B, yes, has had a rough week, and is C, back. I will, at the risk of, I don't want to tell his story for him. He will do that as soon as he can get back on the screen, which we are working on. But I do want you all to know, because like dozens of you have written to Kate and me worried about Chris, and he is recovering. He is among the living, and he is with us today, even if not yet visible. But we're going to do that if we can. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. Delta variant breakthrough infections are really not fun. So I would say, so get vaccinated, except that does not follow, because Chris did get vaccinated. He was fully vaccinated. But Rick Pildes has looked into the soul of America, and he has seen the problem, and it is too much voting. No, I'm joking. That's not where we're going with this. Rick, that you wrote a genuinely disruptive op-ed. Too many elections in the United States, and I have to congratulate the New York Times for the provocative headline. Are we voting too much? Is there too much voting going on in this country of ours?
Well, let me say that the New York Times put two different headlines on that piece.
I was going to say, this is not
sure
the headline that I remember.
Yeah.
It was kind of A/B testing.
Exactly.
They do that with everything, though.
They do. And the headline that tested better is, this is not normal for democracies. So that was, I guess, more provocative than we have too frequent elections. I actually do think that as a general matter, but as you know, in the New York Times piece, I was talking specifically about the 2-year term for members of the U.S. House, which is completely an outlier among major democracies in terms of how frequently elections take place on a regular basis for the parliament or the legislature. Since you wanted to frame things so provocatively, I will say that we have more elections per capita than pretty much any country in the world. I think last I counted, it was something like over 500,000 offices are elective offices. Drainage commissioners, we elect judges in many states, we elect prosecutors in many states, various kinds of commissioners, and I do think that's a separate problem. We vote on many offices for which most people, including myself, when I have to vote for them, don't have enough information, aren't motivated to seek out the information to make voting meaningful. But let's leave that aside and just focus on the 2-year term for the House, because that's one of these issues. I like, Kate's comment about the disruptiveness. I don't know if that was Kate who used that word, but one of the points in writing a piece like that is to get people to step back and look at things that they just take for granted as the normal state of things, because that's the way we've always done things. And to recognize how profound the consequences are for certain kinds of institutional choices that are now deep in the background and not sort of brought out into the foreground to really look at and reflect on and ask, is this actually the best way to design our democratic institutions, and what are all the consequences of choosing one form of design versus another.
So I want to ask you about the House of Representatives proposition, because my first reaction when I read your op-ed was, wow, we would have been, I think the technical term is truly fucked in 2018 if we didn't have a relatively quick opportunity to push back against the Trump administration. And that there was really, at the end of the day, one thing that protected American democracy. People talk about the guardrails held and everything. What really held was that the population said, wait a minute. And that was expressed in a 2-year after the president-elect got elected, people electing 40 extra Democrats to the House of Representatives. And I know the flip side of that is, well, wait a second, 2 years after the people elect Joe Biden, they can also turn around and install Speaker McCarthy, which seems more likely than not. But I'm actually okay with that trade. It seems to me that the ability of the population to respond relatively quickly in the American system, as opposed to the British system, where you elect Boris Johnson because Jeremy Corbyn is really unacceptable, and then you're kind of stuck with him for 5 years. Why shouldn't I respond to your op-ed by saying, damn straight real-time checks, give us all on our smartphone the ability to have votes of no confidence in the presidency. Do it by poll in real time. Why not?
So whenever we're talking about institutional design choices for democratic institutions, it's important to recognize, as conversations often don't, that there are inevitably, pluses and minuses, costs and benefits to different choices that can be made. And so you've articulated one of the serious concerns or costs of having 4-year terms for the House. Now, let me just say two things. First, you could have 4-year terms for the House where the elections were scheduled on off years during the midterm.
That's what I was just saying. That would just completely obfuscate that entire concern, basically.
Yes. So we want to separate out the question, what length term for the House would make for best government, and then when we want to hold those elections. But I think it's very important to think about all the consequences, or I would say all the costs of 2-year elections in the House. Let's remember, one of the things I found a lot of fun in researching that piece is that it forced me to go back and look at the history of how we ended up with the 2-year term for the House. And while I sort of knew this, I hadn't realized quite how powerful the culture was at the time for annual elections. So the view of democracy at the beginning in the United States was, unless you have annual elections, it's not a real democracy. The line is, where annual elections end, tyranny begins. And that's actually
from Federalist 53.
That's right, exactly. And that's and at the time of the states, before the convention, 2 states had elections every 6 months. The rest had them every year, except for South Carolina, which was the only state that had them for 2 years. Now, we could take your view, why stop at 2 years? Why not have annual elections for the House? Madison, actually, as I say in that essay, Madison pushed for 3 years, and the convention, in fact, initially approved a 3-year plan and then compromised for the 2-year plan. But in the modern United States, since the early 20th century, where we created primary elections to choose the candidates for the political parties, for Congress, for races, it's not just that we have elections, unlike other democracies, every 2 years. We have 2 elections every 2 years. or at least members of Congress have to worry and adjust their conduct accordingly for the prospect that they face 2 elections every 2 years. And here we are shortly into a new administration, and even several months ago, the political world was being structured in part by issues about how to position the parties for the midterms, how should incumbents position themselves against potential primary challengers. And as I say, this is not typical of how other democracies think we ought to structure the political process. Now, I grant you, other democracies have a different mechanism for trying to provide some kind of checking function on a government that might otherwise be in power for 4 or 5 years. The advantage of having a government in power for 4 years before voters kind of cast a judgment on how well that government has performed is that that's enough time that voters can not only see what policies governments enact or fail to enact, it also gives voters a much better chance to actually experience the effects of policies and make a judgment about how they're working out. When we have primary elections, 18, 20 months after a general election, and voters are starting to decide they want to punish the party in power, and of course, we have the reality that midterm elections almost always cost the party in power seats, and that can't be a rational reflection of how governments have performed. It's also very early to be able to make any realistic judgments about the effectiveness of a government for voters to go out in a year and a half after they've taken office, cast a vote, which is essentially a vote pro or con on the new administration. So I think there are many, many costs to the 2-year term, particularly once in the 20th century we added primary elections into the mix. Now, to step back to the bigger picture question that you're raising, whenever you're designing democratic institutions, the question in part is, do you design them for the worst case scenario? Do you design them for what you think the average case is going to be of how governments are going to perform? If you are tremendously worried about the risk of an authoritarian or tyrannical or demagogic government or presidency, you can strongly disempower the government from being able to act effectively. And elections in 2 years for part of the government is one way of providing some means of doing that. But you have to realize that there is cost on the other side, which is you're also making it much more difficult for a government to perform effectively. And we have big issues these days, as we know, in the United States, and not just here with democracies in the West. Governments appear to be much less effective at being able to deliver on the issues that large numbers of their members consider urgent. And there's a real cost when democracies can't deliver effective government, including alienation from democracy itself.
All right, so help me out here, because it seems to me that the comparison to other democracies is confounded a bit by, well, among other things, the absence of a no confidence means in the United States. So theoretically in the UK, and it is only theoretical because the Conservative Party will not vote no confidence in Boris Johnson, but very really in countries like Israel and Italy, the parliamentary system supports governmental collapse at any time. So you actually don't need that 4-year term. Theoretical 4-year term is a maximum term. In the United States, the 2-year term is a real term, absent criminal conduct or, something that'll get you expelled from the House, which is a high bar. So how does that interact? Maybe the optimal answer is, you have a relatively long term, but a alternative means of the government falling apart, which, the Canadians, man, like we is known to every democracy basically except us, right? There's some means by which the government, other than the expiration of its terms, dissolves and you go to new elections. Is the magic formula the combination? Because I didn't used to be terribly worried about, the left would tell me, but when a tyrant has power, you wouldn't want to have made that argument. And I would scoff and say, come on, we have 200 years of uninterrupted democratic or quasi-democratic government in this country. I'm not really worried about that. And I repent all such statements, that I have made in my youth, like a year and a half to 5 years ago. I do think, like, I would not want to go to the polls and elect Speaker McCarthy and then be not able to get rid of him for 4 years. And I do have, I do look at the last 5 years and I say the only thing about American democracy that has really, really worked well is majoritarianism. And my whole orientation toward counter-majoritarian institutions has been really disrupted by the fact that the more majoritarian an institution is, the better it functioned in the Trump era. And so I look at it and I say, well, maybe the answer is this whole presidential system. You've actually bitten off a piece of the problem, and the real problem is presidential as separation of powers. And, a lot of countries do just fine. Like, Canada kept its Doug Ford in Ontario. He didn't go national. And they have pretty sane politics at the national level. Maybe we just should give up on this whole independently electing the president thing.
Well, you have moved quite a lot, it sounds like, in 5 years.
I mean, yes and no. The truth is, in lieu of fun, I always, reserve the right to experiment with. But I am much more respectful of majoritarianism than I used to be.
Oh my God, I don't know where you're coming from with that, but like,
yeah,
I'm going to let Rick answer.
I was a little surprised by that way of putting it because, of course, one of the important institutions during the last 4 years that was an extremely strong bulwark against sloppy government, impulsive government, was the courts. And of course, the courts aren't majoritarian. And the U.S. system isn't a majoritarian system, as you know, because of the fact that, I don't mean because the Senate is elected, based on the states, but just the fact that we do have these staggered terms for the House, the Senate, and the presidency. It's not like in a single majoritarian moment, a government goes into power and the majority, therefore, is, So I'm not sure about the term majoritarian here institutionally.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, sure.
Do you just mean like electoral majority? Or elect, like voting, like the elect, like the voting majority? Like, do you mean like in the presidential election, the way that Hillary won the majority of votes in the country? And then it didn't the Electoral College didn't deliver her the election? Or like, I don't know. That's what I don't understand.
But I don't want to sidetrack this conversation with my meditations on majoritarianism.
No. I kind of think it's fast. Anyways, I think it's related. I think it's very related to what Rick is talking about. I just think that I'm just trying to understand what you meant.
I guess what I meant was that the more the founders were obsessed with this idea, and the House and the regular elections of the House is an exception, but they were really fixated on counter-majoritarian checks on the wills of temporary majorities. And the justification for this was that they were afraid of the rise of a demagogue who would play to public sentiment, would win, public acclamation, and then would become a dictator. And my frustrated observation is that the more majoritarian and reflective of simple popular will an institution was over the last 4 years, the better it tended to perform against demagoguery. So the House did better than the Senate. Congress did, in my judgment, better than the courts. The Electoral College, which was there to prevent the rise of a demagogue, no matter how the people chose to vote, ushered in the demagogue over the majority of the vote. There was an inverse relationship, in my judgment, between institutional performance and in the fight against demagoguery. And we can argue about whether the courts are the exception to that or whether they did as badly as I think they did. But my point is, my experience of that, rightly or wrongly, causes me to be very respectful of temporary majorities in their desire to check non-majoritarian institutions in the name of democratic will.
Let me. I mean, since we're operating now with this much broader perspective than 2 or 4 year terms for the House, let me actually bring some comparative perspective to bear on this, to chasten you a bit, hopefully. So, one of the things that we've discovered in the last 7-8 years, decade maybe, is how much more vulnerable than we might have thought democratic systems are to what some people call electoral authoritarianism, or governments getting elected in legitimate elections by majorities, and then using their power to dismantle or significantly hamstring the various institutions, the press, independent institutions of other sorts, the courts, that stand in the way of their just ramming through their vision for the country. And I think that's one of the reasons, not just because of recent experience in the United States, but looking around Europe, especially Poland, Hungary, but these trends are there in other countries as well, France, Germany. That's one of the reasons more in general we experience democracies, I think, as more fragile, or we are more worried about their fragility than we might have been 10 or 20 years ago. And the comparative political scientists who look at this phenomenon of electoral authoritarianism and its increasing encroachment on a truly democratic system, conclude that the systems that do not allow electoral majorities to so immediately transfer their will into control of other institutions, like the US with bicameralism and with a good independent court system, are the ones that are most resistant to what we now see as one of the major threats to democracies, not the threat of a military coup or democracy being overthrown in a moment like that, but majorities electing figures who then use that power to dismantle the institutions that provide some set of checks and balances on governments. So look, this is a much bigger discussion than we're talking about, but I would hardly think this is the time in the history of democracies to be celebrating unbridled majoritarianism.
No, I don't mean unbridled. I mean a little bit less bridled. I mean, I am still hung up on the issue that Trump lost, that the people never voted for Donald Trump. Not once, not the other time. That the institution that was designed to protect the people from the rise of a demagogue midwifed the ascendance of the demagogue and considered it unacceptable to consider playing the role that it was actually structurally designed to play. And so I look, I agree with you that this does not necessarily have to do with the whether you have a 4-year term or a 2-year term or a 1-year term for the House. It does have to do with whether there is some immediate feedback mechanism that we have tended to associate with the first off-year election. And so, if you could say, okay, 435 members of the House, and we're going to have 110 of them elected every year, so that there's a House election every year, but it's only a quarter of the body, so that the president gets some kind of a feedback mechanism, I'd be more comfortable with it. But I'm wary about the idea that the president goes 4 years without the public being able to say, but actually, Mr. President, you suck.
So let me give you another perspective from the states, which we don't talk about that much in this context.
Are you about to say recall, please? Are you about to say recall?
Well, I'm going to tell you a story in which recall is a little bit of an element, but not the whole story. So I don't know how many people know this, but the terms for governors early in our history were 1 year or 2 years. And 2 years actually remained the sort of median term for a governor, 2.5 years, all the way up until shortly after World War II. And then at that point, almost all the states made the decision to move over to 4-year governorships, except Vermont and New Hampshire. Those are the only 2 states now that don't have 4-year terms for governors. Why? Because the view was governors, the states couldn't be governed effectively with so many elections for governor. And state constitutions, of course, are much easier to amend than the federal constitution. And so they were amended by popular vote to these 4-year terms. And no one right now is pushing for governor's terms to go back to 2 years because of the horrible specter. Now, obviously, a president is much more consequential than a governor, but states have survived bad governors. Kate mentioned that this was accompanied. We do have a little bit of a vote of no confidence in the U.S. system, if you think about it this way. A number of states did adopt the recall for governors and certain other state officers. And in fact, when the move to 4-year governorships was made, a number of states, it was done in conjunction with creating a recall for exactly the reasons that we're talking about here. The idea was, longer terms are better in general for more effective government, but we do want a mechanism to check a really awful governor who might get elected. Now, the reality is, of course, recalls are very rarely used and very rarely effective, though they are sometimes. Obviously, California threw a governor out through a recall. And many states don't have a recall for a governor, even though they do have a 4-year term. So I just think that history is interesting, to put next to the history of the House. Again, there were a lot of things about the early conception of democracy that, we later decided we wanted to revise. It used to be the case that the way democracy was understood, you could not hold office unless you actually literally received a majority of the votes cast in an election. That was part of the understanding as well. If no one gets a majority, there's not a legitimate election. And what did they do? Well, in many states, the Constitution required you hold the election again until somebody gets a majority. And in some places, this actually meant that for the 2-year term of the U.S. House, for the member from that state in a particular district, the seat was never filled, because they had election after election over 2 years, and no one actually literally got a majority of the vote. And in other states, you're muted, Ben, sorry.
Sorry, this is basically what happened over the last 4 years in Israel.
Yeah.
It's It's different because of the way the party system is built that way, but it amounts to the same thing.
But
you literally can't form a government.
But to form a real government, you do need. I mean, it makes sense to form a real government. You do need a majority. What we later learned is that it's completely fine to say that the plurality vote winner wins the seat, and that's not inconsistent with how we understand democracy. Just like with the governors, we decided over time 4 years is a more appropriate term. Obviously, this issue with the House is just is not going to be the subject of that kind of debate because it's so hard to amend the U.S. Constitution that it's hard to get these kinds of debates going at all because people realize that the end game is kind of fruitless, and there isn't going to be a significant change. Now, I've said in that piece and in other work I've done, as a way of checking governments in between elections, I actually would like to see us give more power to the minority party in Congress than it currently has. And other systems do provide these kinds of minority party rights. You could imagine.
So what does that look like?
Well, in some places there are sort of audit committees that the party out of power controls. In some systems, the party out of power has the right to subpoena government officials or to conduct hearings. There are days, some systems have a day where the opposition party actually sets the legislative agenda for the day. You see in the British system, obviously, when the prime minister goes to parliament and it has to answer oppositional questions directly, opposition party questions. There are ways you can empower. We know in our modern system where political party alliances determine so much of the behavior in Congress and its relationship to the White House, that if the same party controls the White House and the House or the Senate, you're not likely to get a lot of checking, oversight kind of function out of that institution. And so that's why I think some greater rights for the party out of power to get information, to investigate, to call witnesses, to hold hearings. The minority obviously still can't legislate. Majority still has to control legislation, but that's another thing to think about in this context of how you strike the right balance between accountability and effective government. I mean, I think it's easy. Yeah, it just.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I'm sorry.
No, I just want to drive this point home again. But it's easy. I think it's easy for people to see that if we had elections every year for the House, which was the view most people wanted when the Constitution was formed, there'd be more accountability. But it's easy to see how much less effective that would make government.
Right.
And when we experience all this turmoil and uncertainty and primaries and midterms coming up, and the government only has a year and a half to get anything done, because then the system shuts down in the run-up to midterm elections. All of these things need to be seen, and their origin in the 2-year term for the House, I think, needs to be recognized. And so that's the question, is how do you strike the right balance between those two, effective government and accountability? Sorry, Kate.
No. I think that's exactly right. And that's what my question is kind of following up on. So, and I've had for the last 15 minutes, I just have been kind of waiting to get it the right timing. And so this is perfect. So what it strikes me reading your article, to kind of narrow the focus, but also widen it in some way here. It strikes me that the argument that you're making with the House is very specifically one of kind of being able to make a more effective government, as you just said, being able to make a government that can do its work and govern. And I think that is one argument for fewer elections, right? You just give them more time. They don't have to be out campaigning. They're not as thrown about by these thrashing masses, all of this kind of stuff. The second part is that there are the thrashing masses, and that maybe there's almost a Danny Kahneman type of thinking fast and slow type of argument around limiting people's ability to so quickly change their minds. in electoral politics, and then maybe we want people to be more contemplative and have more actual work product from a representative before they make a judgment, that they're not just making it based on like some gaffe that they make at a public speaking event because they haven't been able to get anything done because they've been campaigning for 2 years and then campaigning again. So like that's like a kind of a second point. But the third point that I don't hear you mention, which I find kind of compelling, is I wonder what this would do for corruption in politics and like the entrenchment of lobbying and the entrenchment of other certain types of like interests. I see the House elections as being on years and off years, obviously. On years are like with the presidential term when more people show up, and off years are off, except when they're not and you're challenged unexpectedly and has to be this huge bum rush to kind of bring out the vote and really, really campaign because there's some type of like national kind of consensus that like are funneling of money into these various races. What happens? Like what become the motivations just in terms, like what pressures get alleviated besides the good ones? Besides the bad ones? Like what bad pressures, what risks do we run having representatives only run every 4 years in terms of kind of entrenchment and corruption? Like in terms of like, both in terms of like money and like seeking money and like how they end up becoming kind of, you know, it's, I don't know how you.
Well, no, I think the biggest risk is the one Ben is concerned about, certainly, that if it was a 4-year term and it was scheduled at the same time as the presidential election, you know, you'd still have a third of the Senate up in the midterms, but you would lose the ability to really hammer a truly horrific administration. But otherwise, you know, we could talk about whether it's possible to reform the campaign finance system in any meaningful way, but it's leaving that to the side. You know, more frequent elections, more demands to raise money. That means for primaries as well as general elections. That means more time spent on fundraising and less time devoted to other activities such as legislating or learning about issues. And, you know, I was thinking in relationship to your comments also about the term limits movement. And what many, I don't know if you want to call them, let's say, academic experts on Congress said about term limits for members of Congress is, you know, what's going to happen if you term limit people is you're going to lose a lot of the capacity to develop expertise and knowledge that builds up over time. You're going to make them much more dependent than they already are on staff and on lobbyists. Because if they're, you know, only there for a relatively short period of time, and a 2-year term is certainly a short period of time, it's difficult to build up the resources to resist what you're being told by the people who seem to know much more, the lobbyists and also the staff that's around long term. So, you know, with 4-year terms, they still have to raise money. Senators, of course, have to raise money, but they wouldn't have to spend as much time obsessing about that as they do from the minute they walk in, when they know they face the risk of a primary, 18 months or so after they walk into the door. So I see mostly benefits in those terms.
I think that I see mostly benefits too. I just was kind of very curious if like you thought that like there would be some type of lack of pressure might be like really kind of like show either not a corruption, but like you said, like, you know, the trade-off of accountability with being able to be industrious in this kind of in Congress. Like I see that. I also see like all of the things that go bad with the Senate, and you're moving them closer towards like, you know, you're moving them closer towards those types of relationships and those types of entrenchments.
You know, I was told this quote from a senator. I did try to track it down once, and I never managed to find it. I assume it's true, but I don't know for sure. I think it was supposed to be Fritz Hollins. Hollins said that at one point. But anyway, the quote was, this is for a senator: "In my first 2 years of a Senate term, I'm a statesman. In my second 2 years, I'm a diplomat. In my last 2 years, I'm a demagogue." And
That's pretty awesome.
Can you hear me?
That's a pretty good line to sort
okay,
of
let me just ask a
crystallize
question
what
then.
we're talking about.
Because my sound has completely gone.
Sorry, well, the
do
floor is
regular
yours.
independent elections have any impact in preventing demagogues from coming to power and sort of facilitating a decline in democracy? Or is the regularity just a signaling mechanism that sort of indicates the health of the institutions in a country?
You mean the fact that we have elections every 2 years is kind of a sign of having a robust democracy, because we know we're going to have these elections. We have them all the time, regardless of any other circumstances: civil war, international war, depression, financial crisis. Is that kind of the idea you're getting at?
Since he can't hear, I think I'll translate for him. I think he means, is the regularity of elections primarily a signaling mechanism a la the one you describe, or does it have real accountability components as well? I mean, is it primarily a set of symbolic gestures that reflect a certain commitment, or is it primarily actually an accountability mechanism?
Well, I think I would say more the latter, but I'm not sure it's really a form of accountability. I don't know if that's it is in some sense, but what I want to mention again here, we talked about it at the outset, and people kind of know this, but I'm not sure how well it's front and center in their minds. We know that since 1934, in every midterm election, the president's party has lost seats in the House. Now, what kind of accountability does that reflect? I think what it reflects is that presidents campaign in ways that try to make themselves as broadly appealing to as large a slice of the electorate as possible, or at least the slice they think they need to get elected. That often means suggesting different things to different audiences, leaving things vague, avoiding hard decisions, and that as soon as you go into office, governance requires choices, and choices inevitably alienate some number of voters, including voters who might have supported you. I don't think it can be rational to conclude that essentially every presidential administration since 1934 has performed so badly in their first 2 years in office that they deserve the sanction or the punishment, if you will, electorally, of losing seats in the House. So it is a form of accountability, I think. I mean, things happen. It's not just symbolic. Seats change hands. And those changes can have significant consequences on the politics. But I don't know whether it's the kind of accountability we're really looking for in democratic elections. If that's how it works, that it always has that effect, nearly always.
What is the democratic accountability we're looking for in elections? Is it just direct one-to-one, in and out type of accountability?
Well, I think that it's partly a retrospective judgment on how well people in power have used that power on behalf of the voters, on behalf of the citizens of the country, the people in the electorate, and it's also it's accountability for where things are, where we want things to go in the next coming years. It's partly retrospective. Many political scientists think what voters are mostly doing actually is casting a retrospective judgment on how well those in power have used the power that we've given them. But you want it to be some judgment on how people have performed in office and how the direction they are likely to take political events. And if it's so negative, so consistently, in the 2-year midterms after an election, you do have to wonder whether it's providing that kind of accountability.
So that seems to me to be your best argument, that the fact that midterm elections always go the same direction implies that they're not actually serving a judgment purpose. They're serving some other purpose. And I guess my question in response is, what if we take the election and the midterm that follows it as a package, and you say the election will tend to overstate the enthusiasm for the candidate, and the midterm is the corrective to the over-enthusiasm. So, the people really liked Barack Obama, but they didn't like him that much, filibuster-proof majority level. And so it actually takes two elections to reflect a kind of instinct over time about what people want the balancing of power to be. And we just don't have a good way of doing it in a single election.
Well, I don't know how we would test your assertion that voters are always over enthusiastic and don't really want as much as the candidate they're voting for seems to be promising. So it's a good thing they can correct themselves, 2 years later by saying, oops, I endorsed you, but not to that extent. And gee, what a nice happy optimum we've reached now. You'd have to tell me a pretty good story to, really convince me of that.
I have no good story to tell you, but I will note that Kate has acquired some newborn kittens. Paula, the floor is yours.
Newborn. I just don't want to be. I'm sorry, Rick. If I was looking over to I was looking over to the other side of the screen. I'm on vacation in Montana, and the farm just got 2 baby kittens.
Those are adorable.
Kittens. Yes, they're very cute.
They're so adorable.
Wait, there are some more kittens.
Yeah, there's another kitten
over there.
Yeah, they're just kind of all over. So this is Maud, and she wanted me to. Hello,
Maud.
She can't hear you, but she wanted to play with me to play with the kittens, and I'm trying to tell her it'll be a little bit. So thank you.
All I know is every time I come on, you guys are in some amazing outdoor location, and I'm just still in my same office home.
I'm still in my same boring office location too. Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So my question is, on your NYU faculty bio page, it says that you have criticized excessively romantic understandings of democracy. And I was wondering if you could explain that and maybe give a proper understanding of what the morality of democracy is, or maybe the ideal system. Because I can say, at least from my own experience, which isn't worth much as a student starting her first year at law school, that I do think there is an argument to be made that a lot of people, whether in good faith or bad faith, think that the Constitution, at least when we talk about American politics, is this unchanging celestial document that has never been reformed, which is ahistorical. But I think the way that we think about our system of government does kind of romanticize this kind of godly defined document, which doesn't change at all and can possibly hamper even the best kind of reform.
Well, I think part of what I mean by overly romantic conceptions of democracy is that in the U.S. in particular, we have, reformers at least, have tended to think that if citizens are just given more opportunities for political participation, they're thirsting to take advantage of those opportunities. Everyone wants to be as engaged with politics as reformers tend to be. And so we make institutional design choices based on the premise that we're going to have all this participation and engagement. And that turns out not to be the case for a lot of reasons, including the fact that many people have good reasons not to be as engaged in politics. You don't have to be obsessed with politics. And also that take the example of voting. You have to actually have the motivation to seek out appropriate information to cast a vote in a meaningful way. People have that motivation for certain kinds of races, but they don't have it for all the races that we vote on, like who should be the drainage commissioner in a state that has drainage commissions. The people who participate in those elections tend to be the ones with the most of a vested interest in what happens with that political body. It's often the special interests who turn out for those elections, because it's not the case that most citizens are going to be showing up all the time.
So this is super interesting, just because I was literally just talking on the farm about the drainage commissioner, because no, I'm serious. No, I mean, and they know everything about drainage commissioners. And they were talking about how they want this whole reform for drainage commissions, and how it and having a full-time drainage commissioner that stays in the valley and regulates the water changes all of their income for the year, all of their planning they can do on their farm, everything that they can do. And it's fascinating. And I just think of it as that's a crazy little local election, but they care so much more about that than they care about, I guess Montana just got another representative because they gained 100,000 people. But there's just generally, but more than they care about their tiny little slice of the house. And so I wonder what that balance is between state and local elections, and how people care about them versus their representativeness in the federal system, and how that trade-off kind of works.
Yeah, look, I agree with you that local government in many parts of the country is the most important level of government for a lot of people. And it can certainly be the case that certain sort of offices are particularly important in certain parts of the country. There's still a question of whether we get the most effective government in those positions by voting for people rather than having people we have voted for appoint people to those positions.
Yes.
One of the other ways, to go back to the question that I was asked, one of the other ways this, what I call the romantic conception of democracy, that actually I think it is a distinctly American conception of democracy. I think we emphasize popular engagement and participation much more so than most democracies do. I think a lot of these institutions were actually that we're voting on, that we're talking about, like elected judges and prosecutors, come out of the Jacksonian era.
Yes.
At the height of that kind of understanding of democracy.
Yes.
And then once offices are made elective, it's very hard to turn them into appointive offices over time, because there's too much of a sense that you're trying to take something away from the people. But as another example, all the work I do in the election context, we are unique among democracies in having partisan elected officials do things like design election districts or oversee the administration of elections. And part of the reason for that is it's been very hard to convince Americans that independent institutions, structured in certain ways, appointed in certain ways, would do a better job of providing fair and impartial administration, let's say, of election laws or of designing election districts than people who are elected. And in the United States, there's far more resistance, far less willingness to create these independent kinds of institutions. And what you will frequently hear is, well, at least I can vote for these people, who are drawing these districts. But the reality is legislatures aren't really punished for how they draw election districts, no matter how much partisan gerrymandering they engage in. It's so
indirect.
It's so indirect.
Yep.
Right. You need a lot of information to know the details. And it's a very indirect issue. And it's so low down on the list of things people are going to care about by the time, they go to exercise their vote in the polling place. But this romantic idea that, no, we control these people, so it's better for the system, stands in the way of creating independent institutions that I think there's good reason most other democracies, have adopted these institutions for these kinds of functions.
Daniel, you are wildly out of your native habitat, but the floor is yours.
So I am curious as to whether you think the Senate has produced better governance outcomes because of the longer terms that senators serve, and how we can know that's due to the longer terms given the variety of other factors that might explain the better outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, of course, neither chamber can produce an outcome alone, right? So the legislative process requires, bicameralism. But yes, I guess if asked to express a judgment on this, I think for all its problems, and this is leaving aside the, massively malapportioned nature of the Senate, but just in terms of how it functions versus the House. Yes, I think an institution with longer terms has been more deliberative, has been more kind of thoughtful. This is not true at every moment in American history, of course, and great things have come through the House. But if I had to say in general, yes, I think the quality of legislation and the legislative process is greater in the Senate, or has been at least historically, than it is in the House. And I think the longer term contributes to that.
Can I ask a follow-up comparative question, which is that I'm curious, do people use internationally the bicameral model that as we do the popular versus I don't know, the kind of the elite, obviously there was the House of Lords and there is the House of Commons, but as democracy, as the New York Times dubbed your op-ed the normal way of democracy, is there a movement away from kind of that model? What is the abnormal part of how we do it?
Well, the abnormal part is having a part of the legislature, the body that represents the people, the lower house, elected on such short terms, and having midterm elections and having them have to raise their own money on top of it. So the norm is that the government's elected, it's going to serve 4 or 5 years. Many of these systems don't have a fixed election cycle. The government at some point, which is understood to be not more than 4 or 5 years, calls a new election. And I'm not aware of any system that has shortened those terms out of the view that, gee, that's turned out to be too long. That's a mistake.
Do any lengthen the Senate part?
Well, most fade the Senate, the upper house, into non-existence, if it exists at all.
I see. So it's not just and how do you feel about that, Rick? Okay. About a movement. So sorry. About
you
a
look
movement
like you're
away.
being overwhelmed by kittens at the moment.
I am a little bit, but how you don't mention
this is the birds. There's a movie to be made here, an update of.
I know there's something. So there's oh God. Anyway, what I was gonna ask was just before we to follow up. Is that part of what you're proposing, which is basically this idea that there would be a house that is 4 years and things fade into just a 1 4-year body, one body elected 4 years and maybe rotating years? Or do you suggest that is it really you're limiting your suggestion to 4-year terms for the House and then 6-year terms for the Senate?
Yeah, I wasn't thinking at all about the Senate in this context. If you wanted to make the U.S. more like a parliamentary system, you could have the Senate elected for 4 years, the House elected for 4 years. They would all be elected on the same cycle as the president. There are arguments for that a government is more likely to go into office and have an actual mandate. But I wasn't proposing anything about the Senate. Of course, the big issue with the Senate, as we all know, is how huge the disparities have become over time between the largest state and the smallest state in terms of the number of voters. But I'm not. Yes, I'm not. At least in this vein, under this hat that I'm talking about right now, I was leaving the Senate to the side for other discussion, I guess.
I would get wholly behind this proposal if there were a companion proposal that the House can dissolve itself on a vote of no confidence and go to new elections at any time, or that the Speaker that the Speaker can dissolve the House, so that you have a mechanism by which the the term can be as short as public confidence retains, or up to 4 years.
And what I like about a mechanism like that, and what I like about the no confidence mechanism in many other democracies, is that the midterm election is an incredibly crude way of trying to make a judgment about is this administration performing so horribly that it should be thrown out before it gets the full term that it was elected to serve. These mechanisms that are reserved for more exceptional contexts, and that can be triggered in exceptional contexts, seem to me a much better device than a midterm election. Because, we do want, in my view, all things being equal, we would want governments to be able to serve for 4 years or 5 years. That's a reasonable amount of time for governments to develop policy, to enact policy, and for voters to experience the effects of that policy. We don't want every 2 years for the government to be significantly cut off at the knees, which is what happens with midterm elections, unless they retain such a huge majority in the House. But if you want to have a fail-safe mechanism or a safety valve for truly horrible administrations, then a mechanism like that can be brought out under these unusual circumstances is much better tailored to that problem than the system that we have, which was, of course, was created, with certain assumptions at the time it was created, and in many ways has performed, very, very well. But it's always important to, re-ask some of these foundational questions, especially as circumstances change.
And there was one additional assumption which you haven't mentioned that they made at that time that is really no longer true, which is that the legislature was a part-time endeavor. And, it would meet for a period of time and then people would go home for many, many months at a time. And
well, some people still own Shooter's Bar and Grill, Ben. Sorry.
Well, thank God for that. No, but I mean, like, if you're electing somebody for, to go to Washington a couple times a year for a 3-month session or something, it's a bit of a different thing than if you're electing a national government, which is really what we're doing now. We are going to leave it there. Rick Pildes, you're a great American. It's good to see your face.
Good to see the kittens.
Yeah,
I'm really sorry. I did not mean to be in any way disrespectful. I'm kind of just not totally in control of my environment at the moment.
We will be back tomorrow at a special time. Genevieve de la Fera has persuaded the estimable Eric Feigelding to come on and talk about COVID variants. But it's going to be at 3 o'clock Eastern time, not 5 o'clock. So if you show up at 5 o'clock, no one's going to be here. Maybe by tomorrow we will have figured out how to get Christopher Argyris on screen so that he can tell you all about what has happened to him over the last couple of weeks. Until then, and by then I mean 22 hours and 55 minutes. No, sorry, 20 hours and 55 minutes from now. Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but we still do have 2-year terms for the House and sleeping kittens on our shoulders. But
I just noticed you guys do polls, and 2/3 of your listeners think we should have the 4-year term.
That's correct.
I should also add, by the way, Rick, that I completely agree with you, and I like have thought this for a long time. But you obviously made the argument much more intellectually than my intuitive opinion about this. But it was really fun to talk about it.
So who are we going to get to introduce the constitutional amendment?
Yeah.
I think every member of the House would be behind the amendment.
Yeah, it would.
It's like
it would go to the states pretty fast.
Yeah, exactly.
I think so.
And every state legislator would vote against it because they want those House seats. That's exactly right. It's a real conflict of interest there. Interesting.
Well, you have to send it to ratifying conventions in the state.
That's true.
Yeah.
We will see you all tomorrow. Thanks, Rick.
Take care.
Bye.